Hey guys, if this is your first video, we are doing a series in the Gospel of John. So this is the second video in that. I'm going to be in the second chapter of that. If you want to see the first one, it's the video before this. It's called What Are You Seeking? So if you've got a Bible, feel free to turn second chapter John. If you don't, I'm going to read it as always. So the passage that stuck out to me, there's a lot going on in the second chapter of John, but this is the passage that spoke the most to me. So this is the one I'm choosing. Not that every verse in there is not important. But starting in John chapter 2, verse 13, it says, "And the Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves, and changers of money sitting. And when he had made a scourge of small cords, he drove them all out of the temple, and the sheep, and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overthrew the tables. And he said unto them that sold doves, Take these things hence, make not my Father's house a house of merchandise. And his disciples remembered that it was written, The zeal of thine house hath eaten me up." So that's 13 through 17. That word zeal is a Bible word that I think a lot of us have heard throughout our time. If you're not a first time or not a new believer, if you grew up in church, you've heard that word zeal. And I think I'd heard that word for years and years before I actually ever cared to look it up and see what it means. So the definition of zeal is the feeling of being incredibly motivated, eager, and driven to accomplish an objective. So in another word, it's a passionate pursuit. So imagine you're on your way home from work and you see that your house is on fire. You can see it from the road. You got a long driveway maybe, but you can see the smoke. You wouldn't slow down and say, I hope somebody does something. You would stop. You would run. You would call 911. You'd bang on the door. You'd bust a window. You'd do whatever you had to do to get in there because you don't know if your family's in there. You don't know what's in there. But you would do that because what you love depends on how you respond, right? That's passion. You're passionate about that. Now, other people might drive by and watch you doing all this and say, they're being crazy. That's crazy, right? Why would you try to run into a burning house? Why would you get that close? See, zeal always looks extreme to people who don't share your passion. So Jesus wasn't out of control in the temple. He was displaying an appropriate response to something that deeply mattered. See, Jesus demonstrates a holy zeal, a passion that every believer should seek to imitate. Not uncontrolled, but a God-centered commitment to his Father's glory. That's the title of today's sermon, A Passion Worth Pursuing. If you look at this passage and you break it down as I have looked at it throughout this week, the start, the key, the engine to all of this is number one. If we're going to be Christ-like and we're going to try and imitate that zeal, if we're going to try and pursue the same passion, if we're going to try and be Christ-like, then it starts with a passion for God's presence. Now, here's a Bible nerd moment for you. The original Temple of Solomon housed the Ark of the Covenant. The Hebrew word Shekinah, which means dwelling. It was the dwelling place of God here on earth. And his presence, that Ark of the Covenant, was housed in the innermost sanctum called the Holy of Holies. And the Holy of Holies was only allowed to be entered once a year by the high priest of Israel on the Day of Atonement. But this temple that he's flipping tables in John chapter 2 is not that same temple. This is not the temple of Solomon. This is the second temple. The second temple, a key thing to know, history tells us that after the Babylonian conquest, the Ark of the Covenant was not there. They had lost it. So this temple, the second temple, at the time that Christ flipped tables, it wasn't there. The Holy of Holies was empty. I think that's important to point out because his house, his Father's house, the dwelling place of God, had become a marketplace. It says in verse 14, he found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves and the changers of money sitting, just all the people that were selling. And Jesus wasn't angry because commerce existed. He was grieved because his Father's house had become this marketplace instead of a place of worship. And one thing that you need to know for context is these money changers, they weren't doing one for one. You had to have temple coin to buy these sacrifices, and you would take your Greek or whatever money you had at the time, you'd take that in there, you'd go to a money changer, and they would change it out. They would give you so much based on how much you gave them, but they were making money. It wasn't one for one. You wouldn't give them $1, for example, and them give you one temple coin. It would be you give them $1 and they give you, or you give them $2 and they give you one, or I'm not sure what the rate was. I just know they were making money on these transactions. And he was upset because this had become a place of profit, of earthly profit. His zeal, see, it started with a deep reverence for the holiness of God's presence. He understood the magnitude of having the ability to access the Father. And he was angry with how little they valued that. He had a passion, right, for the presence of God. He was angry because of his impending death to gain humanity the opportunity to be in communion with God. Angry for their lack of reverence. Angry for the irony of it all had to have been. It was the same problem that they'd had continually. It was the same problem they had in the garden. Adam and Eve chose themselves over the presence of God. He came and walked with them in the cool of the day every day, and they chose want, they chose lust, they chose temptation rather than the presence of God. They didn't value that presence. They chose themselves over God. And this is the same thing. This temple is supposed to be where God is, and they've turned it into this place of commerce so that they can gain earthly pleasure, so they can gain money, so that they can make money on the presence of God. They're selling this. And the irony of that had to be heavy for Jesus. They didn't value God's presence. I mean, think about it. The creator of the universe has given them an opportunity for a relationship, and they had better things to do. Sounds a lot like us. They were selling sacrifices to cover their sin so that they could regain communion with God. And Jesus stood in his Father's house as the ultimate sacrifice for sin, as the way back to communion with God, as the sacrifice that was going to be given for 30 pieces of silver, as the sacrifice that was going to cover their sin. And they chose themselves rather than God. One thing we can take from this is we serve a God of second and third chances. The sacrifice in the garden, the sacrifices in the temple, Christ's ultimate sacrifice. If you die and you go to hell, you will be sent there by a God who is heartbroken because he has chased you across eternity to try and give you an opportunity to come to him. Do you have a passion for the presence of God? Is it something you treasure? Is it paramount? Do you have a reverence for it? If our goal is to be Christ-like, then it starts with a passion for the presence of God. The next thing is a pursuit of God's purity. In verse 16, he says, "Take these things hence and make not my Father's house a house of merchandise." He's essentially saying, take these things out of here. This is not a flea market. This is not a place to trade. This is not a store. See, Jesus didn't simply notice a problem, he confronted it. His passion moved him to action because he loved what the temple was meant to represent. He loved what it was supposed to have been. He knew the history and how far the children of Israel had to even come to have a place to worship. And he was resolved to guard the purity of God, to stop the mockery of his Father's house. See, a holy zeal or a passion for God's presence refuses to compromise with sin because sin leads us out of God's will. A passion for God's presence creates a pursuit of God's purity. Once God's presence is paramount in your life, you want to hold on to it. There's nothing quite like it. You want it to be ever present in your life. You want it to be continual. You don't want to do anything to put yourself out of that presence. And sometimes that passion requires the courage to confront what dishonors God in our own lives. We have to have the ability to see where we are falling short and flip the tables in our own lives if necessary. And don't miss this, it's because the Spirit of the Lord no longer lives in a temple. He lives in you. He lives in me. See, Old Testament God had a temple for his people, and New Testament God has people as his temple. And sometimes you have to flip the tables of your own life so that you can come back into that communion with God. So it starts with a passion for God's presence, and then you have to pursue God's purity. But even more than that, you have to make a priority of God's purpose. In verse 19, it says, or in verse 17, it says, the disciples remembered that it was written, the zeal of thine house hath eaten me up. They recognized that Jesus was fulfilling the words of Psalm 69, where it says, for the zeal of thine house hath eaten me up, and the reproaches of them that reproached thee are fallen upon me. Eaten me up, consumed me. Have you ever been consumed by something? Ask an Olympic athlete what they do for fun. Many will tell you they don't have much free time. Their diet, their sleep, vacations, friendships, daily routines revolve around one goal. They aren't just interested, they're consumed. No one accidentally becomes an Olympic champion because greatness demands total devotion. The same is true spiritually. Casual Christianity has never and will never change the world. See, what consumes us, what consumes our schedule, what consumes our mind, reveals what truly captivates our soul. To build on last week's sermon, what are you seeking? What consumes you? What drives you? What eats you up? Christ's actions flowed from his unwavering devotion to the mission that his Father had given him. What consumes us reveals what we value most. And Christians should be known for a passion that points people to Christ. The question isn't whether you're passionate. Everyone's passionate about something. The real question is, what consumes you? Jesus was consumed by the presence of God. He was resolved to guard God's presence and God's purity. He remembered God's purpose. A passion worth pursuing is a zeal that's rooted in reverence, expressed through righteous action, and sustained by devotion to God's glory and God's purpose. We have enough casual Christianity. We have enough comfortable Christianity. We need a little more consuming Christianity. We need a few more out there that are consumed by it, that aren't comfortable with it, that aren't curious about it, that aren't casual with it, that are consumed by it. That it's in everything that they do, that it's their driving force, that they've chosen to seek Him, and they've been consumed by His presence and His purity and His purpose. Don't admire the passion of Jesus from a distance. Ask God to produce that same passion in you. A passion that values holiness over convenience, that values worship over ritual, that values truth over popularity, that the Father's glory over personal comfort. The world doesn't need more people who are just religious. It needs followers whose hearts burn with love for Jesus Christ, who are consumed by their Savior. When people look at our lives, I hope they won't be impressed by our accomplishments or our accolades, but be astonished by a life that was consumed by one name, just Jesus.